Yo, what's up, history lovers? So, picture this. It's the 1700s in Jamaica, and there's this group of escaped slaves living free in the mountains who are absolutely wrecking the British colonial system. I'm talking about the Maroons, warriors who built their own communities, raided plantations, freed other slaves, and fought the British Empire to a standstill. This is one of the most badass stories of resistance you've probably never heard about, and it's time to change that. Let's get right into it. All right. So let's set the scene. Sales appears out of nowhere, and with a massive burst of gunfire, a wave of Englishmen pounds onto the beach while the Spanish flee inland. The English had actually failed to conquer Spanish Hispaniola, so they came to take this less populated island instead. We're talking about Jamaica here. Spain had claimed Jamaica way back in the days of Columbus, and had promptly enslaved the indigenous Taino people. As disease and brutal mistreatment started killing off nearly all of this population, the Spaniards turned increasingly to enslaved Africans to replace them. Now, in the chaos of this English invasion happening around 1655, roughly 1,500 of these enslaved Africans suddenly found themselves free. Spanish stragglers kept resisting the English until about 1660, but these liberated Africans, they continued fighting from the shadowed woods way longer than that. The Spanish had called these African and indigenous runaways Cimarron, meaning wild or untamed. The English called them Maroons. After some years of intense bloodshed, the Maroons finally retreated into forested mountains, and the English straight up didn't follow them in there. It was recorded that the ways of them became utterly unknown to the white people, and that's how things stayed for many years. Meanwhile, the Jamaican coast became these notorious hangouts for buccaneers like Henry Morgan, who'd murderously plunder Spanish ports and ships. Clergymen were calling the Jamaican city a port royal profane, an ungodly haven for pirates and prostitutes. But here's the thing. The real great wickedness entering through the southern docks of Jamaica wasn't the dwindling ranks of buccaneers. It was the absolutely foul system of slavery. Withered survivors of the horrific transatlantic voyage were prodded ashore, sold like cattle, and forced onto plantations. The enslaved population, which had counted just 550 Africans back in 1662, ballooned to 45,000 by around the turn of the century. Many died from disease and overwork in the brutal, scalding labor of sugar production, and this entire industry was maintained through absolutely heinous violence. One pro-slavery writer casually notes, for crimes of lesser nature, castration, or chopping off half of the foot with an axe. For negligence, they are usually whipped by the overseer. After they are whipped till they are raw, some put on their skins pepper and salt. Rebellion incurs the punishment of being burned alive slowly. Absolutely horrific stuff. And yet, it was known by everyone that up in those mountains there lived people whose very existence defied this entire brutal order. Runaways and survivors of frequent slave rebellions had often joined them or formed their own bands out in the wilderness. And on occasion, often in the quiet hours of the night, the Maroons would return to the plantations. They'd torch the estates, kill the slaveholders, plunder weapons and supplies, and liberate many of the enslaved into their ranks. Because up in the Blue Mountains, there was a place called Nanny Town, home to hundreds of Maroons. Elements of traditions and languages from the African continent were maintained here in this kind of diasporic West African village. Women would plant yams and plantains, men hunted wild hogs, and their children were born free. Actually free. The leaders and warriors answered to the spiritual counsel and wisdom of this Maroon elder called Nanny. Her town, together with outlying Maroon villages, made up what was called the Windward Band of Maroons. In the west were the Leeward Maroons, under the stern leadership of a man called Cudjoe. Many of these Maroons were from the Akan-speaking region of the Gold Coast, first taken captive and sold during wars against rival African coastal powers. So these Maroons were seriously well acquainted with warfare. They traversed the Jamaican hills using signaling horns, brandishing spears or stolen guns and swords. When British planters expanded around the northeast coast in 1722, the Maroons struck hard. Plantations were burned and deserted. Enslaved Africans were inspired to rebel or run away. Maroon raids continued for years with basically no retaliation at first. The British Crown finally sent regiments of professional soldiers in 1730, But both the militia and the military had to face these mountains where they just floundered down false trails into traps, only to be ambushed by Maroons who'd vanished right back into the woods. Maroon warfare, constant slave rebellions, and a correspondingly terrible economy were absolutely bleeding the white population, which was already outnumbered. We're talking about 10 enslaved people to every one white person. At an emergency meeting of the legislature, the governor warns, there never was a point of time which more required your attention to the safety of this island than at present. The British mobilized these large parties against both bands of Maroons and managed to capture several settlements. But here's the thing, many of the slaves they forced to fight for them just defected to Maroons instead. The Maroons regained Nanny Town in a counterattack the following year. The underground rebellion was literally all around the planters, in the trees, in their very homes. The enslaved would listen and pass intelligence about British plans to Maroon scouts. The Windward Maroons themselves were oath-sworn in loyalty to Nanny. At one point, 400 troops, including 100 professional soldiers, advanced toward Nanny Town. One division moved to block the rear exit, but the Maroons ambushed them and chased them off. The remaining 300 marched on, and suddenly the Maroons appeared from behind trees and rocks, shouting, shooting, and absolutely massacring the front lines. The panicked British fell back in chaos. Following this triumph, rebellion sprang up all across the island, and runaways joined the Maroons in droves. The legislature of Jamaica straight up conceded that the Maroons had grown in power to the great terror of His Majesty's subjects. They plundered all around them and caused several plantations to be thrown up and abandoned to the diminution of His Majesty's revenue. One planter wrote that the rebels got the better of all our parties. Our men dare not look them in the face in the open ground or in equal numbers. But in 1734, a large British force quietly scaled the high narrow path to Nanny Town and bombarded the huts with small cannons. Maroons fled the burning village. In the skirmishes that followed, Maroon warriors took the lives of 80 of the attackers, but Nanny Town was lost. The Windward Band dispersed to other hideouts. Some made this long trek to Cudjoe in the west, but the prickly and vigilant chief wouldn't risk harboring those not under his direct authority. He actually turned them back, and for years after that, there was quiet. The planters were recovering some sense of security until the Windward Maroons resumed the fight in 1737. So now the British are realizing they don't have the means or the will to actually conquer these mountains, so they resolved to make peace instead. Representatives first went to Cudjoe and the Leeward Band with gifts and hostages. The terms of their proposal granted the Leeward Maroons ownership and authority over all the land around their settlements, 1,500 acres, plus the right to hunt almost anywhere and trade in colonial towns. Finally, freedom and safety, right? But here's the price of this victory. The Leeward Maroons had to agree to assist the British in putting down rebellions and invasions. And from this moment on, any runaway slave who sought refuge with or even encountered Maroons was to be captured and returned to the slaveholders. That's a brutal condition. Cudjoe signed the treaty in 1739. Some of his men straight up revolted at this apparent betrayal of the enslaved. They attempted to start a rebellion on plantations, but Cudjoe had the leaders of the plot arrested and personally oversaw the executions of 2 of them. Cold-blooded move right there. Next, the British went with beating drums and fanfare to the place of the Windward Maroons. Nanny's people had long held the British in contempt. One observer noted that their women wore necklaces strung with the teeth of His Majesty's subjects. Hardcore, but the prospect of war against both the British and Cudjoe's Maroons effectively forced them to sign a similar treaty. No longer could the enslaved look to the hills for liberation. The British had successfully turned their old allies against them, and in doing so, preserved the slave state. Ships continued arriving with horrific frequency. The number of enslaved people in Jamaica approached 300,000 over the course of the century. The cry for freedom kept growing louder, but massive slave revolts were brutally suppressed with the aid of Maroon warriors helping the British. In 1791, the Haitian Revolution began, a long and cataclysmic slave rebellion. Amid fears of this revolution spreading, British disputes with the Maroons of Cudjoe's old village, now called Trelawney Town, devolved into war in 1795. The other Maroon villages wouldn't support Trelawney Town, but runaway slaves joined the ranks of these rebels just as they had generations ago. Lines of red-coated soldiers were decimated by guerrilla warfare. The British lost 70 men in around 2 months without a single confirmed kill of their own. That's insane. Only scorched earth tactics, burning crops and cutting down forest brush, forced the Trelawney Maroons to accept peace. Yet many were slow to give themselves up, and the governor used this as a pretext to take nearly all of the over 500 inhabitants of Trelawney Town and banish them from Jamaica entirely. They were shipped to Nova Scotia in Canada. The first winter, there was one of the worst on record. The Maroons were stuck in these ramshackle lodgings, totally unprepared for that brutal cold. For years, the Maroons petitioned the British government to let them return to Jamaica, but it was all to no avail. In 1800, the British allowed them to settle in Sierra Leone instead, which was home to many formerly enslaved Africans. A large part of the Trelawney Maroons remained there for the rest of their lives. But in the 1840s, after the British finally abolished slavery, some of them sailed with their families back to Jamaica. For the eldest among them, it was a return to the island of their childhood, an island of lush mountains where centuries-old Maroon communities live on to this very day. So yeah, that's the incredible and heartbreaking story of the Jamaican Maroons. These were people who refused to accept slavery, built their own free societies in the mountains, and fought the British Empire to a standstill for decades. Even though they were eventually forced into compromises, and some were exiled, their legacy of resistance lives on. The Maroon communities in Jamaica still exist today, preserving their unique culture and history. If you're into stories of resistance and survival against impossible odds, this is one for the books. Stay curious, everyone. Peace out.